Alright, what's up, you guys? Today we're going to be talking about the easiest way to get a good composition in art. We're going to be looking at the masters, John Singer Sargent and Frank Frazetta, to get two completely opposite sort of viewpoints on this. And without further ado, I'm going to get into it. So I'm not going to take 20 minutes of your day to explain all of this. I'm just going to say it right out front here, and then I'm going to start, delving into what it means and how it actually works out and all that sort of stuff. So the most important thing in creating a good composition is emotional resonance with your subject. So this goes into the psychology of art, and it's important to understand the psychological aspects of art to actually create a good composition. So all of us know that human beings, every single day of our lives, the thing that we're chasing most often is a feeling. So that's the reason why we work out. That's the reason why we go to certain concerts. We listen to music because of that. We eat food because of that. We seek out certain people because of a feeling they gave us. A lot of human experience is ruled by feeling, and art is really no different. So in art, what you're doing is that you're trying to give the best emotional experience for your viewer. And the way that you know that it's an emotional response is because it's an unconscious response. If I had two artworks right next to each other, let's make one real fast. And we did this, right? We compared these two. Which one would you say is better? Immediately, without a doubt, unless you were obviously trolling everybody, you would say that it's this one. And the reason for that is that subconsciously you take in both of these images and you're emotionally drawn to one of them. And that emotional draw, you could call it a visual draw, you could call it an instinctual draw, whatever. It immediately pulls you in. And what's so interesting in studying the great masters and all this stuff is that you start understanding why certain things draw your eye and why other things don't. And the most important compositional tool for artwork is having that emotional resonance with your subject before you even paint it or before you even compose it or whatever. So we're going to be looking at some of Sargent's stuff, and we're going to be kind of talking about this weird aspect of art. So if we look at a painting like this, for example, just to substantiate what I just said right there, you look at it and it moves you in a certain interesting way. It's saying something a little bit interesting. It's kind of the day-to-day life of people. She's at the dinner table or whatever, and it gives a certain feeling. So the artist's role, John Singer Sargent here, he was probably just going about his day, and he saw that something interesting was happening there. And it wasn't a logical or conscious observation. He wasn't sitting there thinking, oh, well, she's by the dinner table, so I'm going to make this conceptual argument for my art or whatever. No. What he did is that he went through life and he was moved by something, and he decided to capture that. And that's really the artist's role, is to take the inklings and the little kindle of experience, and then to just really blossom it out and flesh it out with a lot of artistic tools. And then once you do that, the viewer can actually get on the same ride as you, and they can understand what you were trying to say. So that's what Sargent's doing here. He's taking that experience and he's curating it. So how is he curating it? What he's doing is that he's using values, mostly, right? And that's what a lot of great artists do, is that they use large value masses to guide the viewer. So as you can see, there's this really bright mass of the painting, and it gives you this leading line right over to the subject. And then if you look at this really bright value mass and this really dark value mass, the subject is stuck right between those. So you go right to the person right here. So it could have been a visual or conceptual draw, emotional draw that Sargent was drawn to. Maybe her sitting in a certain way, his subconscious took that in, and they saw the difference here, and then the subconscious was pulled to it. Could have been something else, but it's important to think about artwork as divided between two states. There's the what, and then there's the how. So what is he painting versus how is he painting it, right? What is he trying to say versus how he's saying it? So what he's trying to say here is extremely, extremely simple. It's just a woman at a coffee table eating an apple, right? Or a peach or whatever that is, right? But how he's saying it is really what brings sophistication to his art. And this is important in, the modern world, because there's this thing going around right now where all of beauty is just subjective, And that is true to a certain extent. People have their preferences and their own individual, likes and dislikes. But if you take subjective opinion and then you take a ton of subjective opinions, let's say 100 people's subjective opinions, you can parse out an emergent sort of objectivity. And interesting thing you can do with that is that you can take a museum, right? And it's done that very experiment over the course of thousands of years, because all the bad paintings generally died off and they got snuffed out of history, and they got thrown away, they got stomped on, they were destroyed. But some artwork prevails through the ages. We remember certain artists and we don't remember other artists. And if we can understand what's actually guiding that selective principle, why certain things last and why other things don't, then you can really start applying it to your own art, and you can do great things with that. So, John Singer Sargent, one of the reasons why he's so admired and also so hated, especially by his own contemporary critics, was because he wasn't really a fantasy painter, unlike, Frank Frazetta. He wasn't trying to make anything too elaborate. He wasn't trying to say anything that was extreme or too conceptual, and they called him kind of kitsch. And he was really just painting daily life, especially in a lot of his landscapes and stuff. This is Claude Monet, He's not trying to say anything elaborate, but the thing that's so beautiful about Sargent and his work is that how he's saying what he is really where all the sophistication comes from. And this is an important thing to consider when you're making artwork. It's like, if what I'm saying is extremely complex and nuanced and interesting, but how I'm saying it is terrible, unsophisticated, and childish, like that, then it comes off worse than if what I'm trying to say is simple. It's very, very simple, and could even be rudimentary. Somebody at a coffee table, for example. But if how I'm saying it is sophisticated and elaborate and masterful, like, Sargent or Sorolla or Frazetta, or, the list goes on and on and on, then it always turns out better than the other case. Now, I'm not saying that you can't have a sophisticated idea and a sophisticated execution. Of course you can have that, right? A lot of great artwork has done that. But it's important when you're starting out to not get too ambitious with what you're trying to say. It's important to learn how you're supposed to say it. And a lot of compositions are born out of accident. And a really easy way to find something, I don't know, you could say, I don't know what to paint. And a lot of people get into that situation, It's like, go through day-to-day life, and the most interesting paintings you're ever going to make from life, at least, are going to be the ones where you just stumbled upon something and you saw a little potential in the world, and then you decided to flush it out. The more intentional and the more conscious you are with a lot of your artwork, the more it's going to fall flat, a lot of the time. Art is a very emotional experience, and emotion is the language of the unconscious. It's the way that the unconscious, psychoanalytically, it actually communicates to the conscious mind, is through emotions, other than dreams. But it's one of the main ways that it communicates. And that's really important, because what that says is that art is a psychological experience. Because if it's an emotional experience, then it's a psychological experience. And once you start going down that rabbit trail, you can really start to understand why good art is good art. Like, subconsciously right now, your unconscious doesn't care as much about the details. It doesn't care as much about what's being represented. It cares about the big main things. You can see in, like, criminal forensics, they can use people's testimony to find license plates and stuff like that, and stuff that you wouldn't more consciously pay attention to, like street numbers and other stuff. And they can actually use those in certain criminal cases. And the reason you can do that through, like, hypnotizing people is because our unconscious is always watching, but it's usually always taking in a lot of information at once, and it's taking in holistic information, right? So, like, the way that you'd apply that to artwork is when you're seeing a composition, everything within the bounds of the composition is actually relative, right? So, like, with this composition, if you squint your eyes, we could just mark it out right here. What's happening there is that this is what's really driving the painting. And there's, of course, this little girl, but she's not as bright. She's more of a mid-tone. And subconsciously, the reason why this looks so good is because everything's really, really dim, and then you have this really, really bright spot. And it's extremely simple what it's trying to say, right? Even the concept is simple. And the execution is simple yet sophisticated. And that's what Sargent did just exceedingly well. It reminds me of, this is one of my favorite paintings that I ever did. And, let's see if I can find it. So this one had a really, really similar premise. Really, really simple. I'm not trying to say anything super elaborate. I'm not saying anything like political or, whatever. It's just a person by the window, right? It's that simple. But it emits some sort of feeling. And it's usually, and when I took this is a reference photo that I painted. And when I took the reference photo, it just stood out among all the rest of them. It felt so much better, so much more interesting. And I was emotionally connected to it. And because of that, the painting turned out better. And it was a funny thing, And I've actually ruminated over it the last year or so since I painted it. And I've come to realize why I was so invested in that photo, why it emotionally spoke to me. And there's so many art principles that worked here, but they were completely by accident. They weren't even intentional on my part, right? So a lot of things are working here. One, the giant C curve that goes in and through the composition. So that gives it motion, And then the leading lines on this thing are just insane. And I was posing it a little bit, but I wasn't thinking about this. But leading line, leading line, leading line, leading line, leading line, like everything is going towards the subject. And subconsciously, what we look for is meaning. Every single day, we go throughout our day-to-day lives, and we're looking for meaning in the world, right? And certain things stand out to us and certain things don't. And it's always an emotional response when you know that something stands out to you. And art is exemplifying that, The original reference photo had a lot of obscure details in the shadows. There was a lot of creases and folds and all this, sort of stuff. And, the drywall wasn't perfect. There was some issues with the drywall and stuff. You just omit all those details. Anything that's not necessary to be said is not only unnecessary to paint, but it's detrimental to the painting because it obscures the point. And the point is what your subconscious is always looking for, Like this is just one big shape. This is one shape. There's very, very little, variance within it. And when you can think about everything as a simple shape, you're really going to start curating an emotional response for the viewers that they're going to respond to. All right, so back to Sargent. But so this is what Sargent was doing. He was responding to things that he saw. And this was the story of this one was that it was, I don't remember if it was his nieces or something, but he was out during the summer and he saw these two little girls lighting these lanterns. And it just spoke to him. It was right in the evening light. And he actually spent a whole summer to paint it, because he wanted to get like a certain look to it. So he kept scraping it off and restarting it and grabbing new canvases and so on. But it took him a whole summer to paint. And it was all from this just one feeling-based response that he got from these two girls. He wasn't consciously trying to say anything, So this is the fine art approach, right? The fine art approach is to see something, be moved by it, and then paint it even though you don't know what you're actually saying. You're kind of like a mediator between the meaning of reality and the viewer. That's what the artist's role is playing. And the fine artist doesn't know what they're saying. If the artist knows what they're trying to say consciously, then they're an illustrator, right? And that veers us right into my next point, which is a secondary way to do composition. So this is Frazetta. And if you don't know him, he was a fantasy artist in the 80s. He did a lot of, he painted a lot of people in, suggestive ways. So he gets a lot of flack for that. But he was one of the best, if not the best designer in all of history. All the history of painters. He was just an amazing designer when it came to painting. And what's so beautiful about his work is that there's so much thought put in every single little shape. But it still works on a really fundamental level. Right? So we talked about being moved by things in our everyday, day-to-day life, right? But how do you do that in illustrative work, like Frazetta? So he came from an illustrator kind of background. He did a lot of comics and all this other sort of stuff, and it came from a constructive anatomy background too. So the people that he was studying was from Bridgman, and his mentors told him to study, like, the constructive anatomy kind of route. People like Loomis, and that's much different than the typical fine artist approach, which was Sargent, right? And Sargent barely knew anatomy at all. He just had a really, really accurate eye. So what he was doing is that he was just recording the shapes just as he saw him. And you can look up the quotes of this. He says that he doesn't paint anything that he doesn't see. He doesn't idealize, he doesn't design. Now, he designs the composition, of course, but he's not actually changing what he's seeing. He's really just putting it down on, And he's obviously, it doesn't look like real life. It's just all brushstrokes, and that's some of the beauty of his. So he is designing it in a certain sense, but drawing-wise, it still looks the very same, right? But what Frazetta was doing is that he was taking anatomy, and then he was spinning it right on its head, and he was just completely conforming it to whatever he wanted it to be. And he grabbed reality like a ball of clay, and he just turned it into anything he wanted. And it's a much more creative approach in that sort of way. But he was still doing it through the same emotional resonance. And how do you emotionally resonate with something that you create with no preemptive kind of thing that captures you, right? Well, the answer is a lot of things captured him from in day-to-day life, right? When he might have been on a bus or a trolley or whatever. I think he was American. And he might have seen a man doing this sort of pose, right? And that might have stuck with him in a conscious or subconscious sense. And then when he closed his eyes and he envisioned a composition, or even just one pose, it might have just shown up like a little flicker. And he just reached back and he pulled that and he put it onto the painting, right? So the way that Frazetta was doing it was just so much more unconscious. But what's so interesting about him is that he wasn't tied down to references. He wasn't tied down to like real life. As far as copying the reference, he was a really good designer of his compositions. And the way that he would do that is by doing these little studies. So when you don't have nature providing certain designs for you, you kind of have to create your own designs, and then you can emotionally react to those different designs. And you'll see in this book especially, they show a lot of his early work, and there's different versions of every single painting. So you'll see, for example, here. All right. So here's one painting that he did. Here's another version, and then there's even a third version over here. So what he was doing here is that he was creating a painting, and then he'd say, this doesn't really feel right. Like, there's something wrong right here, right? Maybe it probably was because it obscured the purpose of the painting, because you always want to point a subject, and you don't want to add in too much detail or distracting elements, or else it'll pull away the viewer. That's probably what he was subconsciously or maybe consciously thinking, but he probably started looking here and he's like, I really want to change this because the design is a little bit off, the compositional design. And so the final, he changed it to this, right? And what he was doing there is that he was emotionally reacting to the painting. And when you emotionally react to it, and my point is, like, with Frazetta, is you can even go the illustrative route. You can even go the more design route. You don't even have to do the Sargent route, right? Where you're pulling all your shapes and details from real life. You can construct the entire image. There was never a reference photo like this that he was copying. You can do that, but you're still using the same fundamental system, right? All art is, you think about it like music, literature, visual art, anything. It's all evoking an emotion from you. And when you think about it that way, it's like, well, there has to be continuity between all of these different areas, right? It's all communicating to the same system because you're responding to it similarly. So the question becomes, well, what's continuous across all those aspects, And it's emotional resonance, of course. And there's a ton of other continuity. Like in music, there's clarity and there's absurdity. Like if you look at the last 30 seconds of Shine On You Crazy Numb by Pink Floyd, it's all just like random ass noises. and it seems like this mess of all this crap, and it's like abstract, And if you look at this, it's the same sort of thing. You can barely kind of tell that it's leaves and branches and all this stuff. It looks like obscurity, but it comes right after the focus, right? So you have the chorus and then you go into all this obscurity. But it's responding to the same sort of system. And this looks right to us. That's the most bizarre part. And Sargent's a much better example of like how far you can go with that looseness, especially in his landscapes. Oh my God. So like, here's a book I have. If you crop this, it'd be an abstract painting, but it looks fine. Like, it looks right. It doesn't, it doesn't look hyper realistic, but your subconscious isn't screaming you that it's ugly like this, It's telling you, it has sophistication to it, right? And when you're thinking about compositions and stuff, psychologically, we don't see the world in infinite detail. And when you start thinking about it like that, it's like, well, I don't have to put detail everywhere, and if I do, it's going to obscure the way that we actually psychologically interpret visual information in day-to-day lives, right? You don't need hard edges everywhere. You don't need detail everywhere. Frazetta put a lot of detail in a lot of places, but like a lot of his other work, like that's just a wash. All the edges are super soft, and that's just like a big shape. You really want to add a lot of simplicity to your compositions because that's going to be the way that you're psychologically going to want to interpret the information, And it's a really beautiful thing. And it's a hard concept to grasp, the fact that you don't need detail everywhere and that it still looks right. Like this, for example. Super loose, And Frazetta was known for being pretty tight, but like you don't even, like this foot is so abstract. You can see like 2 toes, but it doesn't even bother you. And to think about compositions in a kind of holistic way is really what's going to drive the best sort of paintings. And you can see that he was making these thumbnails, right? And this is more elaborate than a thumb. But if you're trying to go the route of illustration, or even more representational painting, like from everyday life, like Sargent was trying to do, then what you're going to need to do is a thumbnail. Because what a thumbnail does is that it takes away all the detail that's distracting and unnecessary. It's necessary in a certain sense, makes things look nicer. But the really big driving force is the value masses. It's not the details. And what I mean by value mass, then this is kind of how you're interpreting it. This is what's really driving the painting. You have this really, really bright, big shape, and then you have a super dark, obscure shape with little detail in it. And if he had made, the composition too symmetrical or something, then it would have looked less visually appealing. But when you have it in this sort of state, you can really assess the big problems with the composition. And the big problems are going to stand out to you with this same thing that I've been talking about. It's the emotional problem. If you make a mark or you create a composition like this, and you step back and something feels off, then you're subconsciously interpreting that information, and visually it's saying that there's something wrong. Whether the point's being obscured, there's a value problem, like it doesn't actually look like what you're trying to paint, a shape problem, whatever. It's always an emotional sort of rumination on what's an issue and what's not. And when something looks appealing, then you also have an emotional response to that. And this gets into like how Frazetta's actually designing. Like if you look at that arm, no arm would actually look like that. You have like the 2 muscles on the forearm. And, everybody knows that there's 2 muscles on the forearm, but it wouldn't, there's no way in hell it would actually concave that deep in. And the way that he knows that you can do that and, get away with it and doesn't look weird or awkward or wrong or whatever is because he's a designer. He knows the anatomy, so he can design the anatomy, And when you unconsciously see that, you don't see a wrong form. You see the idealization of the form, And you emotionally like that way more than if you had drawn it like, a normal forearm. And even beyond like the actual representation what he's drawing, the shapes that he's making are extremely interesting. And if you look at like the video of him speaking, you can look it up on YouTube. Frazetta talks about his art. And when he's describing how he does what he does, he says that it's very simple. He's not trying to say anything complex, just like what I've already gone over. And that he just looks for shapes. You know, he's just creating shapes on a canvas. And if you look at, like, the inside of his forearm there, like, the basic shape of that is just pretty interesting, you know? Like, that's interesting to look at. And that's an abstraction of it, right? When it's put in context right here, it looks like an arm. But what he's doing is that he's making it not only an interesting representational painting by making it look real, but he's making it an interesting abstract painting. And he talks about flipping the canvas upside down to make it abstract, and this is what he's talking about. So it turns into a bunch of shapes. And you can see what's aesthetic or not. That looks like a nice shape, you know? And this shape could be put on, it can be made into like an industrial object, like a knife, or a car, or, you know, whatever. It's just we're emotionally drawn to certain shapes, and we're not emotionally drawn to other shapes, you know? And when he creates something like this, then he says, oh yeah, that's a good shape, and I'm gonna keep that, you know? But if he makes like an ugly shape, like that, if you looked at this, you know, you emotionally go like, ugh, you know? It feels a little off. It doesn't look as visually attractive. And you don't have to even consciously know why. That's the thing, right? You don't have to logically know why it's wrong. You emotionally know that it's wrong. And that's the biggest thing when you're designing composition like this, or, you know, when you're experiencing a composition, the potential of a composition in real life. It's an emotional experience. It's emotionally driven. And it's usually driven by these huge value masses that should be designed very well, you know? Every little shape is designed here, but even the bigger shapes, you know, like this entire, for example, this entire torso is a big shape. But within, you know, it's an attractive shape, by the way. But within the bigger shapes, there's even smaller shapes, and those are designed as well. You know, and that's the beauty of Frazetta, and that's what Sargent wasn't. You know, and fine art with just doing shape, just recording shapes as they are in reality, you can get pretty far with that, and a lot of artists only stuck to that. You know, but when you kind of hit a brick wall, where it's like you can't go any further because all you're doing is just copying reality, and it gets a little boring, you know, at a certain point. And that's when you can really start introducing these other sort of aspects into your art, you know, like the illustrative aspects and all of that. And the way that you do that, the way that you get like a good grasp for what a good shape is, other than an emotional grasp, like a kind of intuitive grasp, is by doing studies of these artists. You know, you should have entire sketchbooks full of studies. And that's how you're going to get in mileage. It does a lot of good things to actually do that. But, and all these guys, I was always doing studies of them. That's really early on. That's a Sargent study. Let's see here. Velasquez study. Sargent study. Sargent study. Sargent study. Sargent study. Philip de Laszlo, really beautiful. He did some idealization, but he's like a mix between Frazetta and Sargent. But another Philip de Laszlo. Like I'm always studying these guys, and the reason for that is because you get an intuitive sense of how to design shapes, what compositions work, what compositions don't work, and it's more sophisticated than an emotional experience. Everybody has an emotional reaction to things. Everybody, you know, has a feeling when they like something, when they don't like something. But to actually know what's wrong and how to fix it, that's an experience gap, right? And it just takes a lot of mileage to understand that. It takes a lot of mileage to learn how to draw, too. Like, if you really want to learn likenesses, for example, just draw a bunch of paintings. You can't really get that many heads unless you're a creep and you're taking perfect references of people on the subway and stuff, you know, every single day. What you should do is that you should study these great artists. You know, not just look at the paintings, really construct them from the ground up with no tracing, none of that crap, no gridding. Just learn how to draw, and you're going to learn how to design at the same time. And you're going to learn how they're using value masses, how they're using compositional tricks, and all this sort of stuff. And when you come across something in day-to-day life that's emotionally captivating to you, then you can reach back into your pocket and you can pull out all these ideas that you've learned. And then you can actually speak the language of art. to refuse to learn the language and to try to say something at the same time is as absurd as trying to speak a sentence in French and knowing no French. It's completely indistinguishable. When your art is bad and your concept is good, it's going to fall emotionally flat. And there's conceptual art. If you're into that, you know, you do you. But it's never going to get to the level of a master. They were sophisticated in a whole other realm, an emotional realm. And to learn that is absolutely pivotal. It's one of the hardest things you can learn, but it's also one of the most rewarding. So I hope you guys had a good time. I hope you learned something. I'll see you later. Thank you.